You have one precious life. How will you make your money work for you? It's time for Sage Money Conversations, where your financial happiness and confidence are always the subject. Here's your host, certified financial planner, Barbara Norman.
Hello, and welcome to Sage Money Conversations. Today we have a really cool guy on, Dr. Thomas Horvath, he's a psychologist and has been specializing in addictive behavior since 1985. Tom has written a book. Let me see if I get this right. Sex, Drugs, Gambling, and Chocolate, a workbook for overcoming addictions. What I love about Tom is he's got some alternate ideas for how to handle addiction. And so I feel really blessed to have you on. Hi, Tom. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you. So one of my concerns when I look in financial planning is how devastating addiction can be, any kind of addiction for a family, and the problems that it creates. Tell me, when a family is in this situation, they're married, they both have legal rights, how does someone even start approaching this problem?
Well, unfortunately, there is good information in the media, but there's also a lot of misinformation. And one of the important distinctions that the media often doesn't cover is the distinction between situation and person. People obviously contribute to addictive problems, but the role of situation is often underlooked. A classic set of studies that's referred to by the collective name of Rat Park is a great place for people to learn about this issue. You can Google Rat Park and it will come up. So what you might have heard listening to the media is that when you put a rat in a cage and you give it the option to have food and water and, let's say, cocaine, the rat will, in relatively short time, die from overusage of the cocaine. Sure. This also is unfortunately true for other substances. A lot of rats have been lost proving this point. Now, Bruce Alexander, who's a Canadian psychologist and psychology professor, said there's something wrong with these studies because they don't replicate a rat's real world and they don't replicate a rat's enriched world. So he created Rat Park. And Rat Park, if you're a rat, is the place to be. There's a lot of other rats, and they have cocaine or heroin or alcohol, depending on the study he was running. And he even brought in some rats that had previously been in those isolated cages and gotten themselves hooked, so to speak. He put them in, and some of them stopped using the substance entirely. Some used it occasionally. But the point of the study was that in an enriched situation where there are a lot of other options, substance use becomes much less appealing. So the first thing we need to think about, and human beings, fortunately or unfortunately, are much more complicated than rats, but when we think about human beings, we need to consider what is this person's situation, and of course, how are they understanding their situation? That's where having long discussions with somebody or getting a therapist involved can be a good idea. But
so are they feeling trapped? Are they feeling nourished? Because it feels like in our society, we have lots and lots of choices. So, okay, talk to me more.
Well, as you say, we have choices, but people don't always perceive them.
Oh, okay.
So that's one of the big issues. But the underlying message is if we can change somebody's environment, then we might have a good shot at changing their addictive problems. And very often when you look at people who have successfully resolved addictive problems, they've gotten themselves engaged in something else. It's a very common theme. Exercise is a big component of that for people, but new relationship, new job, renewed interest in something they used to be interested in. So that's one of the ways to think, and it leads right into the issue of, do I send this person to rehab?
Okay.
And as a psychologist who specializes in addiction, I'm getting this phone call a lot, like, we've got the rehab lined up. Is this a good idea? Well, I've owned and operated rehabs. It can be a good idea, but in the US, they are overused.
They're really expensive too, aren't they? And are they covered by insurance?
Depends. Insurance covering less and less.
Okay.
Ironically, the review paper, the scientific paper that was published in 1984 and 1986 that found that going to residential treatment was no more effective than outpatient.
Oh, wow.
29 studies, except for one group of people, which is the group that couldn't afford rehab, which is the homeless. And they were rarely afforded that opportunity. So if you have a budget for treatment, I would be very reluctant to spend it on rehabs, which can be $500 to $2,000 a day.
Wow.
So it's not a minor expense.
How much per day?
Well, 500 would be sort of a lower end, 1,000 to 2,000. I've seen 3,000 a day, so that you're 90 grand a month. And there are even higher ones, but that would cover most of it.
Okay. Wow. Okay. And they're not generally helpful, is what I'm hearing you say. So,
well, they can be. The big challenge with addiction is that in the long run, the picture is pretty bright for most people.
okay.
In the short run, it's not very bright. People often cycle through treatment multiple times. It can take them several years. So it's that incremental gain each time
I see.
that finally gets to most people being successful. Now, people do die from addiction, and some people do destroy their lives to the point that their lives are very different 5 years later, 10 years later. But this one simple rule for a family is don't spend all your money at once.
Okay.
Because you're probably going to need to spend more. And I'd focus more on outpatient than residential. And if you don't feel like spending much money at all, I would focus on mutual help, which is groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, and other 12-step groups. There's about 36 of them for different topics, subjects. But there's also a whole group of alternative mutual help groups like Smart Recovery, Women for Sobriety, Refuge Recovery, which are very different in terms of how they operate, although their purposes are the same. They're free, confidential, and trying to help people. But you can't beat the price because they're free.
Okay, we'll talk more about then this environment that we're trying to create to help a family member without growing broke, without this getting contentious. And who knew you could do that? So talk about that process, if you would.
So if I have a family member with substance problems, I don't want to take responsibility for the problem. Like, however this problem happened, this is not primarily my problem. But I can start to take responsibility for the solution. And that's another distinction that I encourage family members to consider. Just because I'm not responsible for the problem, I can still take responsibility for solution and look to what I can do differently to help pull good behavior out of this person. There are entire books written on this subject. One of them is Get Your Loved One Sober. Straightforward title, Get Your Loved One Sober. The lead author is Myers, Meyers. And there's other books, but he lays out a scientifically validated approach for eliciting improved behavior out of a partner or a child by making changes in myself. So I'm not responsible for the problem, but by taking on that task, I could have some significant improvement. A couple things not to do. Don't get in somebody's face and start saying, no, you're an addict, you're an alcoholic, you've got to change, and all these complaints. We now have good evidence to show that when you confront people, and this is one of the places where the media gets it wrong, when you confront people, you make them worse.
So like those family intervention programs are no good?
They may be good in the short run, but we're not looking for a 30-day solution here. We're looking for a lifetime solution. And
I see.
People build up a lot of resentment. The other mistake that family members make is they start focusing on the means to the solution rather than the solution itself.
So talk more about that.
So, okay, you've got to go to rehab. Then you're going to go to 90 meetings in 90 days. You're going to see a therapist once a week. You're going to get a sponsor. You're going to work the steps. We're going to put you in sober living. These are 3 workbooks that you need to work your way through. You're going to have a recovery coach. And if you don't do those things, I know that you're not serious about this. That's about as complete a list of things I can think of that somebody might be required to do. Instead, I would say something like, I won't have confidence in your behavior unless I know you're abstaining. And I hope you'll agree with that. And let's talk about alcohol. So I'm going to test you, or I'm going to put you on Antabuse, which is a medication that makes you sick if you drink, so you don't drink.
Okay.
And how you accomplish your abstinence, I'm going to leave up to you. You're an adult. You can figure this out. There's a lot of treatment and support available, and I'll consider discussing with you how to pay for it if it comes to that. But I'm going to focus on the outcome here. That's the outcome I need. You figure out how to do it.
I like these words.
Good.
Feels a lot better.
Put you in a very stable, comfortable position, because that's what you want is the outcome. You don't want to micromanage people.
Right. So let's just say now that I've had this conversation with somebody in my family and I've put the onus on them to get better. How can I create that rapport in my environment so that they start thinking of other options? Like, what could I do as a supportive partner?
Well, one simple thing is just to talk with them. Like, now that you're not drinking, how are you going to be spending your time? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Do you remember when you used to do that? People who develop addictive problems become very isolated.
Oh.
And one of the ways that you can simply overcome that is talk with them. When you look at people who have been successful, the most important factor that they talk about is relationships. And the second most important factor is exercise. So could we go for a walk together every morning and talk about how things are going? And when they talk about wanting to drink or craving it, I'm using drinking, but this could be for any substance or activity like gambling. That's a whole separate podcast on how gambling destroys your financial well-being, but we won't go there today.
Okay.
So you said that you really wanted to drink yesterday. How did that go? How did you deal with it? And if somebody slips, and this is another reality, people are rarely perfectly successful in this process. So you need to have a certain degree of tolerance without tolerating anything. I mean, that's the other mistake. But when somebody drinks off and they're not supposed to be, my first question is, how did you like it? How was it? This is a very disarming question.
Okay.
And it allows them to say, they may say, it actually wasn't that much fun, or I felt guilty the whole time, or wasn't what I was expecting. And you just listen. Or if they say, oh my God, I loved it. I realized why I like to drink. And then the reflection is, I can see that this is going to be a big challenge for you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
People drink because they like it. It's very simple. About 25% of the population does not like to drink. They're never going to have drinking problems, but everybody else is at risk for them.
Well, that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah.
When I think about some of the spouses that they have addicted spouses, and they're frustrated and they're angry and they're, sharpening their pencil with a divorce attorney. I've also heard that when we change ourselves, relationships around us change. So if you were talking to a support person, you've given us some really good tools for what they could say, but how would somebody take the heat out of those threats? How would they calm themselves down enough to have that beautiful conversation that you're talking about?
Thank you for that question. They may need their own support person who will listen to all of the stress they've been through and validate it. One of the challenges with substance users generally is that they tend not to remember all the things that they've done. So if I'm the drinker and I'm blacked out for half of the nasty things I did last night, and if you're my spouse, you're going to remember that stuff in excruciating detail. And I'm going to wake up the next morning and go, gee, it was kind of a nice time last night, wasn't it? And that's, you feel betrayed. And what reality is this person living in? I may have psychological reasons to do that, but I may genuinely have been blacked out. And blackout is a period of time that the person doesn't remember, as distinguished from a pass out when they just hit the floor and are unconscious.
Sure.
So if I've blacked out or grayed out, sort of a minor version of that, I don't remember. So it's not going to be very helpful talking to me about that specifically, but your support person might be useful.
Okay. Okay. So talk to me about some of the resources that are out there that are more kind of the Rat Park rather than, in Al-Anon, I think it's an all or none. And I think that turns a lot of people off. I mean, can people actually go part way, or is it an all or none thing? What are some of the alternatives?
Well, you're asking about the issue of moderation, I think. For alcohol. And this is, again, something that the media often gets wrong. They assume that abstinence is the only solution to problems. And the problem with that perspective is that lots of people on occasion drink too much and have some problems, but to persuade them that they must quit drinking forever is a very difficult persuasion to accomplish. And quite reasonably, they could say, I've had some drinking problems, granted, but I'm no alcoholic. I don't have a disease. I don't need to abstain. And now you're in this big argument. So it's better to set your line in the sand at, I don't want any more alcohol problems in my life.
Okay.
And I might tolerate a few small ones along the way, but in the process of getting to not having them, whether you abstain or moderate, that's up to you. Whether you get treatment or not, or go to mutual help groups, that's up to you. But right now, there's a very sensitive subject to me. And every time I even think about it, I just see red. And, it's going to take us some time to work through this. And that is another suggestion here, is that this is not a quick fix. This is probably, depending on the nature and severity of the problem, we're looking at 1 to 2 years or more of gradual changes, which is why sending somebody off to 30 days of rehab and thinking they're going to come back fixed is not the case. I remember when I was running my rehab, this middle-aged woman, I'm standing in the middle of the living room, and she walks to the front door, closes it, steps 2 feet into the house, looks me in the eye and goes, "I'm here, fix me." I thought, oh boy, this is going to be a lot of work, because we can't fix her. And a great deal of the fixing has to take place in her home environment. Most everybody abstains in rehab. It's easy. The problem begins when you get back home.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's like, just because I quit drinking doesn't make the problem go away, is what I'm hearing you say.
Right. And then there's all those other things that need to be done, because drinking becomes the solution for a lot of different things. So you need time to develop other solutions. If I'm the partner, I want to stay focused on not having problems. That's the end that I'm looking at. The means can be quite flexible.
So what are some of the tools that a partner can use when they're trying to establish this new way of being, this new communication? Certainly, like some of the boundaries. And I think right away about the financial boundaries and, the liability of somebody drinking and driving, the cost of somebody doing drugs. Like, what are some of the things a partner could start doing to kind of protect themselves, if you will?
Well, on the positive side, when the person is not engaged in the addictive behavior, that's the time to be together, to talk, to have fun, reinforce the idea that, hey, it's fun to be in this relationship. And let's assume it's, because this is the more common scenario, he's the drinker and she's trying to take care of things. When he starts drinking, that's the time when she can say, I'm not going to spend the evening with you because, as I told you, I don't like it when you're drinking, or when the person has been drinking to too large an extent. As to DUI, you can get an ignition interlock placed in a car. I think it's on the order of $1,000, but it saves multi-million-dollar lawsuits. And it's a very embarrassing thing if somebody transports other people around, but it's a very effective device for keeping a drunk person from driving. A DUI in itself is a massive expense and time sink. And a second one even worse. So if somebody's had one DUI and there's not complete confidence, an interlock, I think, is definitely worthwhile. There is a device called a SoberLink, which is a combination. It's about the size of a phone, but it's a camera, a GPS, a breathalyzer, and an internet connection. And typically, if somebody blows in about 3 times a day, you're reasonably confident they're not drinking. That would be something to do.
Okay.
There's other forms of testing also. And taking control of accounts to the extent in a marital situation that can be a little touchy, but is worth considering, or putting things into trusts. And there are financial consultants who will help somebody make those decisions, but protecting one's assets is definitely worthwhile. I know people who have gotten themselves into enough trouble that they haven't destroyed themselves financially, but they've lost all hope of retiring. They just don't have any savings anymore.
Not worth it. Just not worth it.
Right.
Tom, if you thought back on your career, you've come through lots of iterations. I love your approach. If you look back on your career, what are kind of 1 or 2 of the critical things that if someone is going through this, what would you offer to them in this situation?
Well, I do want, so now I'm talking to a person who has problems and is considering change. That's the scenario.
Yeah.
One is, I'm going to say, this is probably going to take longer than you think. And it may involve deeper change than you're expecting to make. And my analogy for this is, I have a crack in my wall, and I get the spackle out and fix it, and I paint it over, and the crack keeps coming back. I need to begin to consider that I have a foundation problem, not a wall problem.
Okay.
And a lot of people have foundational problems that lead to addictive behavior as a solution. So if that's the case, the work may be a little more substantial. It doesn't necessarily have to be with a psychotherapist or other professional, but that is an option. And I spend 10 hours a week volunteering to help Smart Recovery be around, and it's entirely free.
Tell me about Smart Recovery.
Founded in 1994 as an alternative to AA, also free, also confidential, and also equally effective. We now have scientific data to show that 2 groups are equally effective, but takes a very different approach. This is not a higher power, let go to the sponsor, the higher power, the group. This is, what can I do inside myself? What behaviors, what attitudes, beliefs? And these groups, with emerging data, the conclusion is that the free mutual help groups are as effective as paid treatment.
Wow.
As somebody who makes his living providing treatment, I probably shouldn't be crowing about this result. But I do know that my clientele are people who have the means to pay for individual sessions, and that's what they want. They're just not going to go to groups. But if they did go to groups, and I do encourage them to go, if they did go, that could be just as effective. So one thing to do is go check out some SMART meetings or AA meetings. If you like AA, I'd go there just because there's so many meetings. SMART in San Diego only has between 40 and 50. But those resources are available, and it's worth exploring. So it's going to take longer than you expected. You might have to go deeper than you wanted, but the solution might be entirely without cost.
I like that a lot. I also like your thought that rather than saying it's your problem, I didn't create it, you go fix it. I like the idea that it now becomes a joint effort with some supportive conversations, and also probably each spouse, each person working on their own stuff to come up with what created this environment and how do we fix it together, which I just really love that approach.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, good. Tom, thank you very much. We'd love to put your link in so our listeners can find you, and then also the link to Smart Recovery. You have been so generous with your knowledge and your help. I can't thank you enough.
I'm very happy to have been here, and I hope it's helpful to some of your listeners.
I think it will be. Thank you.
Advisory services are offered through Barbara J. Norman, LLC, an investment advisor in the states of California and Texas. The information contained herein should in no way be construed or interpreted as a solicitation to sell, nor an offer to sell advisory services to any residents of any state other than the state of California, or where otherwise legally permitted. All content is for information purposes only. It is not intended to provide any tax or legal advice or provide the basis for any financial decisions. The information contained in this material has been derived from sources believed to be reliable, but is not guaranteed as to accuracy and completeness, and does not purport to be complete analysis of the materials discussed. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of SagePath Solutions and are subject to change without notice.